Welcome, everyone. This is Donna Phillips. I'm the Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Center for Civic Ed. I see a lot of familiar names and see some familiar faces too. So thank you all for joining us as we go deep into the new rubric for our simulated congressional hearing for our We the People program. First of all, thank you for being teachers and for caring about civic education so much that you do We the People and that you're logging in after hours to learn even more about the rubric. No one is more dedicated to what they do than teachers for sure. Can you, you can do it in the chat or raise your hand if you attended the general session. I just want to see if we have anyone who was here in the general session so we know if we should repeat certain things or go quickly over other things, just so we have an idea of who's in our audience. So hand up or in the chat if you went to our first general rubric session, or if we have all newbies tonight. Newbies to the rubric session, not newbies to teaching or We the People. Okay, awesome. If you did attend the first one or watch the video, you will hear some repetition, but I think the questions that you all bring to the conversation will also guide what we talk about. We're gonna go really in depth behind the theory of action behind the rubric and the way it was created, why we saw a need for a change, and then how you can use it very powerfully in your classroom as an instructional tool and to guide your students towards success in their simulated hearings. And we have a phenomenal guest with us tonight, someone who helped write the rubric and lent all of her considerable expertise, and that is Trish Everett. You'll hear from her. Trish, yeah.
Hey there.
Yeah. And that's my introduction. Y'all will be hearing from me at different times as we start talking tonight, and I'll turn it back to Emily and also Trish for further introductions and to get us started.
Excellent. Trish, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Trish Everett. I am currently in South Florida, working as an educational designer and instructional coach with a bunch of independent schools. I've been a classroom teacher for 17 years. I was a student in the We the People program way back. And in fact, I saw a couple people here from Fishers, Indiana. I went to Lawrence Central. And then as soon as I started actually teaching in a classroom, I immediately, before I'd been offered my first job, asked if I could start a We the People program, and had been coaching ever since, and have now gotten to be a judge at nationals and to be a part of this amazing process. So I'm excited to see some familiar faces here.
Thanks, Trish. And for those of you who I've never met, my name's Emily Voss. I am the Senior Manager for National Programs and Professional Development here at the Center. And I've been with the Center for a year, but prior to that, for 9 years, I was the State Coordinator in Virginia. So I've had a great deal of experience working with teachers and training as well as competitions, and have worked with many of you in at least last year's round of competitions. So I appreciate you all being willing to join us this evening. All right, so for a quick agenda for what we plan to do this evening, we will talk through why we felt that a new rubric was needed. We'll chat about the rubric revision process. We will do a deep dive into the different elements of the rubric with significant input from Trish. And then we will close up with a Q&A session. So yeah, we have a lot to cover, but certainly we will be able to get to your questions this evening, we promise. So the best way for you to interact with us during the program is with the chat feature. So please feel free to drop in the chat any question that you have as it occurs to you. Donna will be answering quite a few questions in the chat as we go. And then depending on the nature of the question, if it's something we want to maybe address at the end, we might hold it till the end, but we are absolutely willing and able to answer all the questions that you have this evening. So we look forward to hearing from you as we go. So we already asked you to introduce yourselves, so we're already off to a great start. All right, so first things first, why did we decide to work on a new rubric this year? So for those of you who have done this for many years, this I think will probably not be news to you, that there were a number of challenges and issues that folks were experiencing with the previous rubric, both as a classroom teaching tool and in a competitive setting. And a lot of the feedback that we had been hearing over the years was through sort of informal conversations, but it got to be enough interest, enough momentum that we really felt like now was the time for developing a new rubric. So the very first thing we did was seek stakeholder feedback and input. That was the primary motivator of our process. So we had conversations with teachers, with judges, with state coordinators, really folks across the board who are important stakeholders in the We the People program. And those conversations happened before this year's nationals, during this year's nationals, and then we also asked the national finals judges to submit more formal feedback in the very early part of the spring. So we had many of their comments captured on paper. State coordinator concerns and feedback, that also was collected over the course of several years, primarily, as I said, through conversations, but also through post-event forms that were sent out after the national level competitions. All right, so our rubric committee then, we brought folks together, many of whom wear multiple hats. We were seeking the input of board members of the Center for Civic Education because, of course, they understand the strategic mission of the center, and obviously we want to make sure that anything that we do that provides a teaching tool is aligned with that. We wanted to have folks who had experience being state coordinators, either formally or at least in one case temporarily, to ensure that the rubric would work at the for the roles that state coordinators play in organizing competitions and also training teachers. Obviously, we had teachers, we had Trish, chief among them, who could represent the interest of classroom instruction. We had our score team lead from our national competition to make sure that the scoring mechanism actually worked. And then we had alums of the program as well, several of whom have served as judges. And of course, Trish mentioned that she herself is an alum. So alumni who have become teachers, alumni who have become judges, folks that could bridge the gap between the student experience and some other experience as well. So our committee members were as follows. We had Hank Chambers, Sean McClelland, Trish, Beth Ratway, Don Lanier, Michael Blau, Donna, and myself. So our committee was relatively small but mighty, considering that the task at hand was a pretty big one. All right, so our process, we began meeting in May formally, and we met once a week, every week for the entire summer. The first thing we did was start out asking ourselves, of all the rubrics that all of us are aware of in the universe, which other ones do we like? What are elements of them that we like, that we think work well? And then looking at our own feedback from the rubric that we have used before to say, okay, what's working, what's not working, and how might we reconsider or refine the rubric to make it work better for everyone involved. So our meetings over the course of the summer, we talked through different criteria points. We talked through norming practices, different options for scoring ranges, and of course, the implications for using the rubric in the classroom. And we also then talked about how this rubric would need to be able to run the complete gamut of hearings that take place just in a classroom setting, showcase hearings that are not scored, but students are provided with feedback, and then different levels of competition. We have middle school students who compete In some states, we have upper elementary school students that compete. So we needed something that would work for competition for all of those different grade bands. And then, of course, something that would work for national finals. So we worked together through the course of the summer, and I am immensely grateful to everyone whose name was just listed on the last slide that they were able to make this work in all of their other summer plans, such that we were able to submit draft versions to teachers, judges, and state coordinators for comment during the first couple weeks of August. And then we were able to post the final draft along with the state competition questions for high school students the last week of August. So there's your little timeline quick view. Okay, so Donna, we'll hand this one to you.
Thank you. So, as Emily shared, it was a very robust and intensive process. And by the way, please feel free to use the chat with questions that you think of or comments along the way. You don't have to hold them till the end. But, you know, one of the things that drove us, in addition to the feedback we were getting formally and informally and anecdotally, one of the things that drove us to revise the rubric is because, you know, the We the People program and the simulated hearings really are, they're one of our two flagship programs. They are research backed, and we know what a profound impact doing We the People has on the students and also you as the teachers. And although we have national finals, most states have statewide competitions, we have a lot. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of students and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teachers who do We the People without even going to those different levels of competition. And we know that the process of preparing the speeches and practicing in groups and all the things that the students do to be ready for their simulated hearings, whether it's a showcase, a classroom level, school level, or national finals, that's where the magic happens. That's where the knowledge comes together and their civic dispositions are formed in the process. And so first and foremost, this rubric is an instructional tool, because if the students never go on to compete at the national level, this program lives in the practices in the classroom with all the teachers, no matter how far they take it. So we wanted to make sure that this rubric reflected our most cherished ideas about what quality civic education is. At the same time, we also, you know, there were a lot of things about how we were, I'm using the royal we, about how students were judged that were kind of traditions born over time or practices that weren't necessarily codified. So for example, you know, how do we separate out, you know, what students say in their opening speech versus how well they reference the Constitution in the follow-ups, right? Judges would have different ways of doing that. You know, how do we look at participation given the way it was originally articulated? And so we knew that there were these practices that were out there trying to capture what was great civic education. And so we really wanted the rubric to speak to that. Since you are all teachers and I was in the classroom for a very long time, I'll just tell you, I have a love-hate relationship with all rubrics. The second I make one, I hate it and want to like throw it away. Cause like as soon as I get that first student paper or essay, I'm like, oh God, I should have looked for this instead because this is so good. And I, you know, and then in my head, like every time I'm reviewing something, I'm tweaking the criteria to fit the condition. And so no rubric is perfect, but we wanted to, just like our country, continue to create a more perfect rubric and kind of get us closer to that ideal of how we want to, you know, our students to experience civic education. So with all of that, you know, and you can read all the words on the screen here, we think that the rubric more closely reflects your best practices and the type of learning you are creating for your opportunities you're creating for your students in the classroom. And you'll see as we break it down, and if you've already started using it, we're looking for connections. We're looking for, you know, conceptual understandings from one unit applying to ideas and knowledge in another unit. We're looking for the totality of how the students bring all of that together in a deep way, but also a broad way. And so how do we capture that? It is imperfect, but I still think it's the best rubric we've had yet. So with that being said, we'll go to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about assessment. So I'm going to tag in my friend Trish here too, because we talk about this a lot. We know that teachers will use the rubric as an assessment tool, but we're encouraging you to not use it as assessment, capital A, summative. Here's your grade out of 50 points. There are lots of ways to think about it. We want you to use it as a way to give ongoing, continual feedback. And when we kind of go through how we pictured it would be used, it might make sense as a way that kids can keep, moving closer and closer to meeting that criteria. And even if they never meet it, they can still earn the highest points possible on the rubric. How does that translate into a grade? Well, that's the piece that we want you to figure out within what are appropriate parameters in your own classroom, but we really want this to drive instruction and feedback and revision, not final grade. In some other life, when I'm not immersed in civic ed, I'm going to do assessment reform, and then I'm going to tackle homework, and then I'll come back. But let me turn it over to Trish, because I remember some really great conversations we had about this aspect.
Thank you very much. And I adored being a part of this process. First of all, I move that we change the official title of this webinar series to A More Perfect Rubric. Missed that low-hanging fruit.
Oh my God. We must have been fried and forgot to do that.
I'm pretty sure we were. Yeah, so what we were looking for here is not the neat and tidy, did I get all the points answer that so many of our students have been trained to aim for. So even if we were to watch the most perfect unit present ever, I would still have feedback for them. I would still have things I would have loved to hear, things they could have done instead. And I think really the biggest, aside from removing like straight up numbers from it, I think the biggest shift here is this rubric as a tool allows for the possibility of the students surprising us. Right? It's not exclusively looking for one target thing. And if they didn't say that specific court case, then we're done here. But constantly getting them into that mental habit, that civic disposition of constantly checking in and reflecting on their own performance. Ideally, a rubric like this, performance-based, should be like, taking your temperature. There's not a wrong score. There's just one that tells us where we need to be focusing our attention. So really throughout all of the different parts of this, I feel like that came through consistently in our efforts to focus on always growing their skill set, meeting them where they are and helping them wherever they are grow to that next level. So leaving room for us to be surprised by the students and demonstrating constant reflection, modeling it ourselves, and then giving the kids some kind of steps to follow for that, I thought are some really good outcomes here.
And I like the way you said that, leaving room for us to be surprised by the students. And the tension that we navigated in this revision was that it does also it is also a competition, and at the end of the day we do need some way to find rank order and everything. So we wanted to make sure it did both, but first and foremost, the primacy of this rubric was as an instructional tool in the classroom too.
And it occurs to me civic education's fairly unique as far as content area goes, because for a lot of these kids, it's the first time they're being asked what they think instead of told what the right answer is that they need to remember for the test. So, if we're genuinely asking what they think, and the people program has, embedded that in everything, including, picture captions in the textbook. If we're asking them what they think, we need to leave room for a variety of different responses, all being valid. Now, I used to have students who would come into my class and say, I can't wait to take your class because it's politics, so it's all opinion, so there's no wrong answers. if we ask you how many branches of government there are and you say watermelon, that is the wrong answer. So this does have a grounding in the content, as we're going to see in a couple of slides here, but it does also allow, if you want to argue that there are 6 branches of government because of the military and federalism, great, that's a conversation I want to be a part of, and I'm like a little sad when time is called. So that really is what we're hoping to draw out of them.
Thank you. So yes, and I think that leads really beautifully into some features and benefits that we built into the new rubric. Chief among them is comment sections. And so this is meant to be used throughout the student's experience with the hearings, whether it's a round of practice, whether it's a classroom hearing, a competitive hearing. The comment sections will allow space for judges to provide significantly more comments, and comments that are both constructive in nature and complementary in nature, as Trish and Donna have so beautifully articulated, so that the students have feedback they can use, whether this is something that they're going to build upon for future competitions or just better writing in general. We do have a lot more criteria guidance than the previous rubric, which we'll go through at a greater detail in a moment. And the biggest change to the new rubric is the separation of the opening statement as its own category, which once again, we will dig into in just a moment. So as I mentioned before, a lot of what we were doing turned out to be more refinement than reinvention. So the scoring range, the general areas of the categories, a lot of that will look familiar to you from the previous rubric. And then I do also want to make sure that we highlight the benefits of implementing the new rubric and its more direct connection to the Educating for American Democracy framework. So Donna, do you want to mention a bit about that?
Yes. So the EAD, Educating for American Democracy roadmap is another national initiative that really seeks to capture best practices in civic education, and sort of like the C3, which kind of put inquiry on the map and in front and center in teacher practice. The EAD does a lot of things as well, and so we've always believed that the We the People program has always been EAD friendly and already aligned to many of these best practices. And I think our rubric goes a step even further to capture that, so that we are capturing what we believe to be the best aspects of civic education. And first and foremost, EAD articulates that civics and history are taught together. And when I remember when that was the first piece, I was like, oh, well, We the People have been doing that, has been doing that, for 35 years. So here we are, and our rubric captures that within the criteria. The valuing multiple perspectives and critical thinking. The new rubric really calls that out explicitly and actually has that in different places to show different ways of doing that, which is also a key feature of the EAD. Application to real world situations, that's always been like the big thing we want students to do. And so that's captured in the rubric, and that aligns to EAD's objective for preparing students for active civic engagement. A lot of times, as you know, after your students have written their speeches and done their performances and everything, they see those connections, and that's sort of what spurs them to want to take action and be more engaged. That's like one of these like amazing natural consequences of being a We the People student, even though we're not having them do that explicitly. And so it's great that it's already there in the EAD and front and center in the national conversation. And the balanced and thoughtful discussion, which is the hallmark of what happens in a great simulated hearing, which, underscores the civil discourse aspect of what we know is good civic education. And the center has EAD correlations with the We the People program. So if you're in a district or a school, or you yourself are just interested in seeing how it aligns, there's the bit.ly, it's on our website. If you click on networks, you can drop down and see the page that I've pasted here too.
All right. So let's get into the design of this new rubric. So the formatting, as you will have seen it by now, it is best printed on landscape format, although we have lots of other designs that we're working on as well that we'll cover later on. But in landscape format, if you were to print it like this is what it would ultimately look like. So each of the categories has that bright blue category line. It has a little yellow box to indicate here's the score for this category. And then we built it so that there is the criteria for the category in the center, and then space on the left for a judge or reviewer to indicate opportunities for growth, and space on the right for a judge or reviewer to suggest the exceeding of expectations. So here's your kudos. Your case example there was great. That data that you referenced was really appropriate, something like that. And opportunities for growth could be anything. You all have been there. So wanting to provide judges with this direction to be able to provide more background for the students was a key feature for us. All right, scoring spaces, I just referenced the little yellow ones there. And then what you'll see in each of the center sections, these are the criteria for each category. And we are going to go through each of these in detail, but I do want you to just know that we made this so that it was design friendly for the judge or the reviewer. So the judge or the reviewer could very easily just, take a pen or a highlighter, and during the course of a student's hearing, they can check, yes, I heard that this panel just referenced all the elements of the question. Got it. The students, everybody on that panel participated. Got it. And then over the course of me listening as a judge or reviewer, then I would take my pen or highlighter and say, okay, yes, I heard references to the Constitution, scholarly sources, relevant cases. Yes, I heard those things. We're good. So these are meant as examples of what a judge or reviewer might hear. But in a lot of these categories, we are not expecting the judge or reviewer to hear every single element listed. So we will
if I can add here, so a couple of things to keep in mind with these. We tried to find language that would fit the content and conversational style of 6 very different topical units. When I competed, I was a unit 1 person, so I always got like a little heated when people would yell at us for not having cited the Constitution, because the Constitution didn't exist when our time period was happening. So we did try to make the language a wide enough range to include what could be the time periods and the accurate documentation for any of the 6 units. Also, previously when I've been a judge or in the classroom, having it written out like this, yes, you can check the box. Yes, they met the minimum, but it also being written out like this gives the teacher an opportunity, like Emily said, to, circle, historical documents they really hit. So I circled that a few times, or legal opinions they completely left out, so I put a question mark. It does leave a little opportunity for you to kind of reconstruct it in your own mind as you annotate.
Okay, so yes, and kind of just said all of this, but this is what one of these could look like if someone was over the course of listening to a student panel presentation, just keeping track of the references for their own notational purposes. Okay, so also it's worth pointing out features that you will not find. So you all are familiar with the former rubric. We very deliberately did not include a scoring range, and there was a reason for that. There is no range that we could possibly provide that would give judges any more room to interpret what they saw. So one of the things that judges, especially the judges that sat on our rubric writing committee, one of the things that came through loud and clear was that over the course of listening to multiple panels, whoever that judge or reviewer is will establish for him or herself what does average look like, what is above average, and what is excellent and amazing. So with us not necessarily saying a 4 is average or slightly below average, the judges will figure that out on their own. But we deliberately made the choice not to include that range. We also did not include a tiebreaker score box. There is a tie-breaking method, which we can cover later, that is primarily to do with the competition settings. But as I said, we'll cover that later. Okay, so in the new rubric then, students are scored in 5 categories. So previously it was 6, now it's 5. Each category is scored out of a total of 10, and thus the total becomes 50, whereas the old one was 60. So each category is therefore worth 20% of the total score. And the 5 categories are the opening statement by itself, and then the following categories are built off of the follow-up period. So evidence, analysis and understanding, application, and discussion. Okay, so we will dig into each one of these one at a time. All right, so the opening statement. We had a number of reasons for separating the opening statement onto its own category. As Hank Chambers, one of our committee members, so beautifully articulated it in the last session, the opening statement is a way for us to be able to recognize that the students have done the work, but also recognizing that this is the area where students could be influenced by outside sources most significantly. So we're not saying that every single one of your students are not doing original research and not doing the absolute best they possibly can to answer those questions. Many of them are. But we are also working in a time of artificial intelligence, and it is not unlikely that some students might choose to take the easy way out and have the question essentially answered for them, or in some other way be influenced from the outside. Trish, go ahead.
It's also just kind of apples and oranges. This is a highlight reel. They can go through several drafts. They're speaking collectively using Donna's royal we as a panel, rather than speaking individually. So I really love the idea, truthfully, of a separate scoring category for this, because it's just a different creature than the live on the spot follow-ups where you might fumble a word or misspeak, or the live conversational part has a very different feel to it. I do still think the opening statement serves a purpose. It sets a clear kind of table stakes tone. It tells us where our average is going to be, but it definitely is the highlight reel rather than a live performance.
Absolutely. And we did go back and forth to a great degree about whether or not the opening statement should be worth the same amount of percent of the total score as all other categories. And actually keeping it the same as all other categories was a meeting down the middle. There were some committee members that wanted it to be worth more, and some committee members who did not want it to be part of the final rubric at all. So the inclusion of it worth 20% felt to most members of the committee like a recognition of the students' work, but with, as Trish just said, our understanding of how the students really understand the issues at play will come through much more significantly in the follow-up period of time.
Can you flip to the next slide? And
yes.
The instructional piece with that, to me, initially separating it and then reducing its prominence in the rubric, like, hurt my heart a little bit, but as we played it out and thought about what happens in the classroom to get to that statement, the kids' speeches are 11 minutes long, and then they're 4 minutes long, and they've put in so much research, then they've synthesized it and called it down, and then they're retaining all this knowledge that's not even in the speech in a full way because they have to get it to 4 minutes. And so the process of getting it there, we want, we want teachers to continue to do that. And it's that process that's then going to yield the other 40 points, in the follow-ups. So by isolating it and also reducing its weight, we're hoping that that continues to drive the best practices in the process. Sometimes not necessarily with experience, we the people teachers, but we do lots of summer institutes with brand new teachers to the program. And sometimes some of the first thoughts are like, let's just hurry up and get the speech written. And then that doesn't yield, that real deep synthesis of knowledge that the students have when they, that shows up in a negative way in the follow-up conversation. So, backwards by design. So we're hoping that this drives the process that then yields that deep learning.
Thanks, Donna. And I also would like to point out that in the third checkbox of the opening statement, we are still recognizing that the students are using evidence, they're using analysis, they're using application. Yes, and whoever is judging or reviewing will be able to make note of that within the opening statement by itself. Okay, so the next category then is evidence. So once we move into the follow-up period, this is, as we all said, where the rubber meets the road. And so again, Hank has beautifully articulated for us. In brief, the evidence category is, what does the Constitution or the historical document or the quote or the thing at the heart of the question, what does it say? So we are looking for, have the students accurately referenced constitutional text, principles, primary, secondary sources to support their understanding of what that document says? Have they referenced historical events or figures to demonstrate contextual understanding of that quote or that thing? Have students provided historical or current day examples or case studies that would illustrate the impact of the Constitution or the constitutional principles? That's what we're looking for. What does the thing say? And as Trish mentioned earlier, we were very deliberate in our choice of how we were describing what we were looking for, so that students, particularly in units 1 and 6, were not missing out on not being able to reference big C constitutional text. They can absolutely reference constitutional principles if you are in unit 1. And then in unit 6, which also does not always have a deliberate connection to the United States Constitution, are there other examples or case studies that reference those principles, perhaps in an international context? That's all totally appropriate. That will come through in the course of that discussion. So, Trish, do you have anything to add to the evidence category?
Yeah, so here we, like you said, really tried to cast a big net, include all sorts of examples, whether they be historical, current, primary or secondary sources. But not only we're not just looking for a laundry list of specific citations, whether it's case law or, founding father quotes, but also, are they doing it accurately? Are they, if they're arguing that states should retain more power of governance, are they citing anti-federalist papers rather than federalist ones? Are they, they might be using the right tools, but applying them not necessarily in the best or most effective way. And so that's where some of the judges, wisdom and understanding is going to look for not only the right evidence, but the right evidence for the case the students are making, which could look a whole lot of different ways.
Absolutely. Okay, so then category 3 is analysis and understanding. So building then off of evidence. So we have, what did the thing say? Now, in brief, what does it mean and according to who? So, if we're walking through a quote, if we're walking through a case, if we're walking through a historical example, what does it mean and according to who? So in this instance, we are now beginning to look for things like judicial decisions, perhaps constitutional amendments, perhaps even societal movements, is when we're talking about, in particular, the civil rights movement. And have students been able to describe the impact of that on the Constitution's meaning or the case's meaning or what have you? The second checkbox, students have recognized that there are multiple perspectives on the issues. So a lot of the students will do this anyway. Sometimes the questions will deliberately ask students to take a position, which is great. Sometimes the questions don't ask the students to take a position, but they take one anyway, which is also great. And then often the students will recognize perhaps a majority opinion, and over the course of the follow-up discussion, there might be an opportunity for a judge to ask about, okay, but what about the minority opinion on this issue? Whether it's a case, whether it's a decision, what have you. But the opportunity for students to recognize that there are multiple viewpoints, no matter what. So this is an important point for us as well to mention that we never expect the panelists to all agree on the same thing ever. They can, for the course of, synthesizing an opening statement, they can say, for the majority of our panel believes X. And then in the course of the follow-up questions, then the panel might be able to then articulate further. There was, dissenting opinions in our own panel about this particular issue. Great. We don't expect the students to present a unanimous opinion.
That's I think really an important point, that in the follow-ups they are speaking off the cuff, but also individually. And so we often encourage them to respectfully disagree with their colleague, is the phrase they'll roll out often. But also when it comes to various interpretations, I really love the way this ended up being framed, and really the box down in the corner, the in brief. What does document mean according to whom? According to whom can be two different perspectives in the same time period. According to whom could be from the contemporary perspective at the time of its publication versus now with a historical perspective, with a revisionist perspective. So it really opens up, and even if the students themselves don't hold conflicting opinions on it, being able to just recognize that this is not a unanimously held opinion, they can do an anonymous third party, like others might argue that, whatever. And it really ends up feeling like a much more rich and in-depth conversation. So I think the way that this ended up being phrased specifically got to quantifying some of what makes those follow-up conversations feel the best.
All right. And so then that will lead us then to application. So in brief, now that we've discussed what does it say, what does it mean, now how does it apply? So now we can work towards have students addressed how the constitutional issue is currently addressed. We've talked about how it might have been addressed historically, different understandings. How does it address now? How has the legal framework changed? How have court interpretations changed what we understand about this issue? These are all potential things that could come up in conversation. We are also then looking to see if students have analyzed how these provisions and principles can apply to real world situations, particularly now, contemporary debates. And then have students demonstrated familiarity with the principles and frameworks of other countries or other time periods. So this is where we're really offering the opportunity for units 1 and 6, when appropriate, to bring in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the British constitutional system, and sometimes other international systems as well. So there's a lot of potential opportunity there, but once again, we're not expecting everybody to do that. So for example, this year we have, Unit 3, there's a question about due process. we're not asking any of the students to become experts in due process of law of Australia. Forget it, not going to happen. But when appropriate, they can bring in international examples. And then other historical time periods. So if it's perhaps a Unit 2 question, which usually is entrenched in the founding era, how might the students be able to pull that application forward to a current day debate? So that's in brief.
I think this also is the place that gives the most opportunity for imagining hypothetical future applications. What might the consequences of this interpretation be carried out 50 years from now? So especially when you get into like the Unit 6 or, you know, some international policy stuff, this is where, you know, that kid who has like the out in left field classroom discussion contribution, this is their arena to shine.
Absolutely. All right. So lastly then is a category that has grown out of the former category of participation. So this category has become discussion. And one of the things that came up a lot in the feedback from everybody as we were considering where we might take this is that the participation category was so loose that really all a student needed to say over the course of the hearing was, I agree with my colleague, I disagree with my colleague. Okay, well, we've technically heard from everybody on the panel, but that doesn't necessarily bring the substance of the discussion to new heights. So what we're looking for here is how substantive were we able to have a discussion with the group? So did most students actively participate, generating thoughtful insights, contribute to a meaningful exchange of ideas? Have students provided their logical and well-supported reasoning? So students can certainly bring a great deal of that logic and supported reasoning for their positions, whether it's opinion, whether it's based on the research that they've done, any number of things, but offering them that opportunity to kind of rise to the challenge. And then, while certainly not required for them to say explicitly, although many of them often do, they can make reference to and build upon arguments made in the opening statement, so they can elaborate further. And I will point out that this is what a lot of teams do, and many of you will work with your students to do this, to leave the breadcrumb trail in the opening statement so that there's enough of an open door that the judges will say, okay, you referenced this case in your opening statement. Tell me more about why you think that is an appropriate example of X, whatever. That's what the students are doing. We're just being able to kind of describe what that is in this category. Trish, anything you want to add?
Yes. So participation was always like my favorite and least favorite category simultaneously, because on the one hand, in the you know, strictest construction perspective, yes, everyone at the table had a pulse and emitted some kind of sound. Check, 10 out of 10. But it also, this issue of participation is part of what I've always loved about the We the People program, which is it fosters and requires teamwork. You can't have one all-star who takes over and dominates the conversation, because then it's not a conversation, and that's not equal participation among the panel. So you have that one shy kid who you're like super convinced is not going to say a word, and now their unit mates, their panel mates, have an incentive to make some space for them in the conversation, to, you know, specifically like, you know, nudge them and line up an easy shot for them. And the person who wants to just dominate the entire conversation, and I understand the irony of me saying that, having gotten sick of my own voice already tonight, they don't have an incentive to just let me do it. Just forget the group work. I'll just do it all myself because then I know it'll be done right. The incentive here is to actually help cooperate and actually help the whole panel function. And so I think the restructuring of this as discussion, that when I introduce this entire thing to my students, the way I always frame it is that you should be like a little sad when time is called. Like the best follow-up conversations, you're like just getting into it and like, wait, you think we should repeal the 17th Amendment? Hang on. And then time is called and you're like a little bummed. That's a sign of a good presentation to me is that let's go get a cup of coffee and continue talking about this. So I think the way that this has been framed does both of those things. It encourages the actual collaboration and success of the entire panel cohesively, and also rewards the active engagement and responsiveness, because that's the other thing I think contributes to this is responsiveness and participation. In the old rubric kind of slid into this, and the number of times I have watched students answer a question that somebody asked but it wasn't us is like they're trying and they had like that one court case they were totally gonna get in no matter what, but this manages to hit both of those. It gets that responsiveness and actually a back and forth banter conversation, which will require some retraining on the judge's part to ask concise questions that actually have answers that could be given, but also helping to build that mini social contract, that societal structure and community within even just a unit of 3 to 5 kids.
Absolutely.
I think this might be a good place to pause because we have a lot of questions that speak to the judging and a new way that we're thinking about the judging. So let's see. Okay, so and some of the previous discussion may have hit on some of these questions, but I think this kind of jumps me back to our committee this summer, and I think we all had the same questions, concerns, ideas that are being voiced in the chat here. So Tim Colgreen asked, without the guidance of the judges to determine the difference between like a 5, a 7, a 9, each judge determining their own average, do we no longer have a norm within an individual competition? That's one thing. Compare a 7 at a state. It's not the same as at national. 7 is not the same at a state as it is at nationals. Is a 7 in Indiana different from a 7 in Ohio? Okay, so starting with that question, a 7 in Indiana has always been different than a 7 in Ohio. and that's just the nature of the beast, right? Like, every state trains their judges, even with the rubric that had the numbers in it, it landed differently. It landed different in every state. We do train all the nationals judges, as you know, and try to get them as normed as possible. However, even within nationals, and that's not everyone here who's competing at nationals. So this is still just a small, proportion of the total thing. But again, you want to be as consistent as possible. Even at nationals, it's literally impossible to have all the judges in bracket A judge with the same norming conventions as the judges judging in bracket C. And so we're always fighting this battle of what it means to be human and just have different ways of looking at things or valuing something. Similarly, we talked about a historian is going to value a certain type of knowledge that's different from what a political scientist is going to value than what's different from an actual government official or a retired teacher, right? Like it's all, so that it's very imperfect. So yes, Tim, we do expect that. We don't expect a 2 to be the same thing as a 7. At the same time, I mean, I've seen this firsthand. At some state competitions, if you went by a very locked in, this is what a 2 is, it's these, or the 7, it's these 3 things, and the kids brought you one of those things, every kid would get a 2 or a 3. And we don't want kids leaving a competition completely defeated, right? So there is like this range finding that kind of happens when you get the kids in front of you and you start to see, where they're all going to shuffle out. When we talk about the tie breaking, what you'll see is that we leaned into and just kind of named what it is that happens when judges judge 5 teams or 10 teams, which is they rank them in their heads. And then they want to make sure that the scores pretty much reflect what they perceive to be the first team, the second team, the third team. This comes back to always striving towards a more perfect rubric, because how many times every single competition we'd judge a class, and then you'd be like, but that group was actually better, but the rubric yielded a higher score on this group. Why is that? What am I missing? What did I not? And then you're changing the score. So we've talked about this at National Judges Training. So removing these kind of, I think they're artificial things. We also wanted to remove that out of the ether of the teachers with respect to a grading practice as well. So that was another reason for removing that. Rightfully, this does speak very strongly to the judge training. There's a lot more in here, and I'm talking a lot. I'm sick of my voice. So let me see if Trish or Emily want to jump in on that piece, and then we'll hit another couple of questions related, but still different.
So I do want to just sort of in a general way say that there were before and there will be still additional support materials for judges that we'll get into with the judges when we do their training in November, but will be available to you and on our website as well. So yes, there will be additional support materials for judges to further understand the nature of their role, what makes for good judge-student interaction, and the process of judges asking questions based on the student's opening statement, things of that nature. And then also how to work in different scenarios with students that might need additional accommodations. So that happens in the classroom level. It sometimes happens at competition, but we are more than happy to have all of that put out with judge support materials as we go. So don't worry, it will exist.
I think that's also, we literally put in multiple months of work into getting this to be as good as it could be. A work in progress always, but I think it's important to remember all of us, whether judging, which in a competitive sense is a smaller proportion of the participation, or in a classroom sense of just trying to get the kids to grow their own existing skill set, the norming that we're asking judges to use here is happening anyway. I mean, one, we need to consider a lot of these judges are not people who are working with high schoolers or teenagers all day long. So they tend to fall into one of two categories. Either they've seen Euphoria and they're just amazed these kids can like string sentences together and are dressed professionally, or they're a super hard grader professor who, that don't smile till Christmas type. They're having to readjust their own norms once they sit in front of a room full of teenagers. So giving them the tool to rank rather than focusing on the point distinction between the first place and the second place in their own experience, I think really frees them up to look for those opportunities for growth and the areas in which the students really excelled.
And yeah, absolutely, Trish. And I think to tag into some of the other questions about training judges and evaluating them with the rubric, one of the shifts we're going to make is really coaching the judges to listen to the student's opening statement and to derive their follow-up questions from there. So that does two things. One, it still values that opening statement, and it really puts this strategy right in front of the teachers and students to pack that in to lead the judges to the discussion they want to have. and to really, so that the judges can then dig at their deep knowledge, so that there's no gotchas. There's no like, okay, here's the one thing I want to make sure every team says, and if they don't say it, they get an 8, right? We're trying to get away from that. So we will still be providing suggested follow-ups, but we are completely remessaging the use of those suggested follow-ups, and we're kind of pushing restart on the theory of action behind how to form and ask follow-ups. So that will go hand in hand with the use of the new rubric and competition spaces too. I don't think I've hit everything. There's a lot of great questions kind of.
Yeah, and most
here.
of the ones that are like they do have to do more with the judging piece. I do want to make sure we have time to go through more student and classroom support materials, but I promise we will get to the other ones. So we did also create a student version of the rubric, which you can find on the same page as the competition questions. And please bear in mind that we did write it towards an 8th grade reading level because this needs to be usable by a broad range of students. But you may want to use it to introduce the hearing activity to students, because it does provide the explanation up top to say, what is this activity, this performance assessment that we're asking you to do? But then with each category, there's a description geared toward the student. So opening statement, you and your classmates will write and deliver a well-organized and clear speech based on the questions from your unit. As a unit team, everyone should take part in the writing process and delivering the speech. So it's condensing the language and just explaining it to the student. But then they also have the criteria that the judge or reviewer would be looking at as well. So you can hand this to the students on the first day they get the assignment. And this can certainly help the students understand the expectations in each of those different categories. All right, and so Trish has also made some additional awesome resources, which we will be adding to the library of support materials. So Trish, please walk us through these.
Happily. So I don't know how many of the rest of you have discovered Canva, but it's my new favorite. And I get to make all the colorful things. This is actually just a updated rubric version of exactly what I would use in my class. When, I had students doing a run through, unit 5 is in the front of the room. Okay. Somebody's keeping time. Somebody's, writing down follow-up questions as they are asked, and everybody else is watching and looking for compliments and critiques. Specific suggestions and next steps can be down at the bottom, and that can be everything from like, don't fidget so much, it's distracting, to you didn't really answer the question fully. But having the students who aren't presenting still engaged and active in looking for what is being done, what are they doing well, because there's always something, even if we're having a bad day, like, you came in and sat up straight, good job. Sometimes that's the biggest compliment we have for a day, and we just take the W. But also those critiques of even someone having their awesomest day could always be doing better. And so that I have found really helps to build kind of team atmosphere, to have them looking out for each other. The idea being, we're telling you your critiques so you can improve them before the big show. Here, just a nice colorful breakdown with each of the 5 categories. And then on the next slide, I took the scoring guide explained and really tried to, especially with the bold text in each of the categories, emphasize what they should be looking to include. And truthfully, it almost kind of builds a classroom process itself. So, when I was teaching this, I would introduce the initial questions. They would write their opening statement and draft and work on that. And after they brought the draft in, I would say, okay, now go back and add 2 court cases. Now go back and apply 2 historical examples. Now go back and connect that to a current event. So each of these separate categories of add some evidence, now increase your application, now add demonstration of understanding, and now think about how you're going to leave some bait in your opening statement so the judges hopefully pull it and ask you about a court case you have studied the heck out of. Then all of those as kind of you're working your way up Bloom's taxonomy of just starting out answering the baseline opening statement questions and then increasing in that complexity with each additional scoring category that we've got here. So both of these are available as PDFs, and you all will make them magically available somewhere.
Yes, yes, we will. Yes, we're currently in the process of updating all of the We the People pages on the civiced.org website. And along with that will come a significantly more robust, essentially teacher toolkit of resources that go along with the new rubric and classroom teaching, et cetera, et cetera. We're so excited. It's going to be great. Okay, so comment sections. Okay, so getting toward the end of our slides here, we've talked pretty extensively about the comment sections, but we did just want to make sure that it was clear that if you were giving that to judges and that or judges or any other reviewers, whether it's being scored or not, whether those would be provided to the students, then that needs to be made known to the judges or reviewers ahead of time so that they can ideally write legibly and write comments that don't require some sort of deciphering in their meaning. So, when you're providing a useful, critique or a comment or a compliment, just make sure we can read it and that we can understand it. Very helpful. So, and then no matter who it is that's working with the judges or reviewers, whether it's you, whether it's the state coordinator, whether it's us, all of us will message this, that the comments are meant as part of the student's learning opportunity to take the feedback and potentially to use it to improve their statements, because particularly in states where there's a regional that leads to states, the students are often have the opportunity to either revise their statements or take into account information that maybe they received on their answer to Unit 1, Question 1, and now apply it to Unit 1, Question 2. Whatever it is, the students can make use of that feedback. So that does involve providing the judges or reviewers time to do that. And so that's certainly something that we are taking into account for the competition that we run at the national level, but we'll also certainly be discussing that with the state coordinators as well, just to make sure there's time in between hearings for judges to jot down the feedback.
So real quick, sorry. To my mind, in a classroom setting, the comments section is the meat and potatoes. Like that is where the to-do list for, prepping for next time, for next week, whatever, is coming from. And then also I've definitely had years where the exceeds expectation side, students who, wow, you guys are really crushing it on eye contact and verbal expression in Unit 2. Would you want to talk to Unit 1 who needs to work on that a little bit? So where they are excelling in one area, they can partner up, help each other. Honestly, if I were using this rubric in the classroom, I would probably take off the numeric score section before I ran copies or before I made it available to students. The number on here, I think, is just a distraction from, did you do better yesterday, or did you do better today than you did yesterday? What thing are you going to do even better next week than you did this week? And the actual reflection and growth, rather than, I think when we start tying numbers to it, as I know a competition necessitates, but certainly my students, once they saw a number, they wanted to know exactly how many points they lost and why and where, and they were defensive about the things that the judge said they should have done better. So trying to launch conversation and reflection, I think comes through, I hope comes through in this tool.
Thanks, Trish. Okay, so briefly, and this has more to do with the competitive setting, so bear with me. So in the event of a tie in the previous rubric, you had the tiebreaker at the bottom, and it was meant to be a score out of 100. We are recommending instead that in competition situations, whether it's an in-school situation, state, etc., that the judges simply rank order the teams that they saw. So that can be done. You can simply ask the judges to like jot a number down. There might be state coordinators that choose to make this a more formal form to fill out. That's not you, don't worry. But the former tiebreaker out of 100 was functionally the same thing, that the judges would rank the teams that they saw and back into a score. So we simply just are recommending that we rank order the teams that the judges have seen, and then that could be taken into account in the event of a tie. So at the national level, the judges will rank the teams they saw every day. And then in the national case, this will be an electronic form. Again, don't worry about that right now. That is a very small percentage of this to be addressed more fully later. But I just wanted to explain what we were thinking in terms of the tie-breaking scenario. Okay, so as far as the implementation of the rubric goes, we'll be using the rubric for the national final. We would love for you to use this in the classroom and to guide your preparation process as you either use it in the classroom or work your way toward regional and state hearing events. As I mentioned, the state coordinators may make small changes to fit the needs of their state. So, for example, we have had a couple of state coordinators. One has made the rubric into an Excel sheet so that it's easier to capture the scores and the comments that way. That's great. And then another one has made more of a portrait format that's black and white and more easy for printing. So we do have other versions that will be out in the world, but we would love for you to take this for a spin, and we would certainly love to hear your feedback as you do. So with that, I'll mention we have 2 more sessions. The next one is primarily meant for state coordinators who are coordinating the use of this at the state level. And then we will have a rubric training for judges on November 2nd. It does not matter what level those judges are normally working with. If there are folks that you usually call upon to do practice rounds with your students, to do in-school competitions, and then, of course, we'll be using or reaching out to folks who do state and national level competitions as well. Anybody that you have that you would like to have familiarity with this, let them know. We'll certainly be putting it out on all of our channels as well. So, and then, of course, all of those will be recorded. So in the event that you need to train a judge in the future, we would be able to provide that in addition to all of these other support materials that we're working on as well.